Dear students, we will be covering in this module the demographic transition, how it moved from various stages in developing country like India, and what is its way ahead. If this trend continues, where we are heading in the demographic aspects and also with respect to various developmental parameters. In this context, the outline of this presentation, let us focus on the demographic scenario in the areas of various population parameters when we talk about developing countries, developed countries, and in various regions of the world, and also the various parameters, especially the population size and growth, the births and death rates, the sex ratio, the urbanization process, the literacy levels, and various socio-economic indicators, how over a period of time they showed its presence and the extent of change that has been noticed, which have come up through the successful completion of demographic transition in some countries and the other stages in which the other countries are experiencing in demographic phenomena. In this sense, as we have seen that most of the countries prior to industrialization and urbanization in 2 to 3 decades back, and also when we talk about the world scenario, the 18th to 19th centuries, it is very clear that most of the countries were at the first stage of demographic transition, where the major characteristics are high fertility and high mortality. And then in that process, the first stage was experiencing low population growth. However, given the change that happened due to industrialization, urbanization, modernization, the individualization started coming up in a big way, and the family transition, the participation of women, especially in outdoor jobs, and also women's status when it has improved, it all have shown significant impacts on the various demographic characteristics, which ultimately led to the changes in the population characteristics. So, if we look at most of the developed countries in terms of these population characteristics, it is very interesting seeing that these countries like Belgium, France, Japan, Netherlands, Switzerland, Greece, Italy, Spain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, most of these are developed countries, and the major characteristics in demography is that they have experienced very low population growth, and also population size is almost stabilized, and their births and death rates are very low. For instance, the crude birth rate in those countries of developed societies are characteristic of having between say 10 to 12 is the general norm per thousand population. Similarly, in the case of mortality, the number of deaths per thousand population, which is a crude death rate, is also supposed to be around 7 to 10. So, in that way, the difference between births and deaths became marginal, and that is why these societies started having a stabilized population. In fact, over a period of time, they also started having a very low population or even negative population growth, and these characteristics have reflected on experiencing population aging. Similarly, the other countries like United States, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, if you look at, they also to a great extent have succeeded in stabilizing their population, and which is clearly reflected in births and deaths as they are very low, and thereby they experienced a low population growth. In contrast, if we look at these demographic data of various developing countries, the trend is in opposite direction. These countries in developing societies, like for example, Liberia, Uganda, Angola, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Indonesia, Thailand. These characteristics of these countries are that the growth rate is very high, mainly because the births are also at a high level, ranging from say 25 to around 45, and in contrast the deaths are at slightly lower, where these countries are experiencing around 10 to 20, and this way the difference between births and deaths are larger in proportion, and this leads to very high population growth. In that sense, the developing countries are still not able to stabilize their population growth, and they continue to experience high population growth, which is leading to high population problem in those societies. Similarly, when we talk about infant mortality, maternal mortality, total fertility rate, in the characteristics of fertility and mortality also, we can see a contrasting picture. For instance, those developed countries like Belgium, France, Germany, Netherlands, Switzerland, Greece, Italy, Spain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, they are all having infant mortality in single digit. For instance, it is around 3 to 5. Whereas in the case of maternal mortality, women who are at risk for dying is also their proportion is very, very low. In the sense, there is an assured survival for their living conditions for women in these societies. They are free from the risks that are there while they are exposed to conception, delivery and postnatal care, and thereby they have a fair infrastructure facilities, especially in health infrastructure, and also the medical technology is at advanced stage, which is clearly reflecting on very low infant mortality and very low maternal mortality. Furthermore, given the mortality at a very low level, and further is also seen in the case of fertility. For instance, when we talk about a total fertility rate, which is also at very low level in these countries, which is to the extent of only between 1 and 2, which is very low. Similar is the case in other developed countries like United States, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, United Kingdom and other major developed societies. So, what it clearly indicates is that the fertility and mortality response to development in these societies are clearly reflected. As long as a country is experiencing development, it has an impact on the reductions in the fertility and mortality parameters. Whereas in those developing countries, given the inadequacy in their attaining the development, that also has an impact on high population parameters, and the rates are at a very high level. What about the other characteristics, like in the case of childhood population, which is usually below 15 years, and the elderly population, which is at international level for 65 and plus age group, and also the women who are adopting contraceptives, and also the life expectancy with respect to males and females in these societies. It is a very contrasting that these developed countries like Belgium, France, Germany, Netherlands, Switzerland, most of the European countries and USA and Australia, we can see that the proportion of childhood population in the total population is at very, very low. In fact, when we compare with the elderly population, in most of these societies, they are almost equal, or even childhood population is in minority compared to the major segment of elderly population. What it clearly indicates that the caregivers for elderly population is dwindling, and the elderly population, given its increasing at higher levels, these societies can be labeled as aging societies. Similar is the case with respect to the achievement in family planning program. When we talk about family planning users, it is very clearly seen that majority of women or couples in general in developed countries, or adopting various methods of contraceptives, and thereby they have full command over on their fertility and also the contraceptive usage. Similarly, given these changes in the population spheres, it is very clearly reflecting on the life expectancy at birth. For example, in most of these developed countries, there is a very high life expectancy experienced both by men and women, and furthermore, it can be seen with respect to female life expectancy, which is relatively higher compared to men, and they are to the extent of around 75 to 85 years. Whereas, look at in the case of developing countries. In the developing countries, still they are experiencing very high fertility levels, very high proportion of childhood population. In fact, it is as high as almost half of the total population. We can see that this population in most of these developing countries are having to the extent of 40 to 50% of their total population are below 15 years. That is why these countries are called young countries, where the childhood population is very high. What is the scenario in the extreme age group of 65 plus? We can see that their proportion is very, very insignificant, even it is of single digit of maximum 2 to 5% in most of these societies. And similar is the case with respect to developing countries in the achievement in contraceptive rate, where very insignificant women only are able to accept, or couples in general who are experiencing family planning adoption. It all have a bearing on low life expectancy. For instance, the life expectancy is almost 40 to 65 years in developing countries like Liberia, Uganda, Angola, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Singapore, and these countries, where there are some changes over a period of time, but the countries which are still labeled as developing are also experiencing, no doubt, but the changes are not to the expected desires. What about the urbanization process? It's very clear that those developed societies are all have succeeded in moving their population to urban areas, or the societies became urbanized, and thereby the process of urbanization has succeeded in the concentration of population in most of the urban areas only. That is why the urban areas, which are major characteristics of having an organized life, at the same time having adequate infrastructure facilities for maintaining good quality of life, is a major characteristic of developed countries. Similarly, the density of population as measured with the number of people per square kilometer is also at a lower level when compared to some of the developing countries. That is why they are having a good quality of life, and also they are able to achieve the desired level of family size. Whereas in the case of developing societies like Liberia, Uganda, Angola, Afghanistan, these societies, the very, very low urbanization has been the characteristic which ultimately led to the population concentration is highly dispersed and also very low in the country as a whole, which is also clearly showing that the urbanization process is not increased significantly, which is an indication that these countries are becoming slowly urbanized, but it takes several decades to see that they are on par with developed countries. Though China is the number one country in the world which has the highest population, the projection shows that by 2025 we are going to see that India is going to be the number one country, next is the China population. What it clearly indicates that given the political will and also the factors that are contributing for bringing adequate measures in controlling the population, a country like China has succeeded in enforcing one-child policy in their population. Whereas in a democratic country like India, though we have a very huge population, given the wide options that the couple can have through which, like persuasive methods and providing various mass media approaches for the couples in a country like India, we follow a system where the couples through voluntary way of approaching, they can be persuaded to adopt small family size. And in this way, it is very clear that India is to a large extent has to work it out several measures to see that the population is going to stabilize. In the case of India, it is very interesting that given the heterogeneity and the diversity among the population living in various geographical regions, the level of development is not uniform. And given the variations in the development, it is also reflected in its influence on population characteristics. And that is why, like any other developing countries, India has also a mixed method of showing its performance in population stabilization. In the other way, we also should know that in the case of India, if we look at the population and other characteristics, there is a clear-cut positiveness of interpretation, wherein we are able to see that on one side, the population size is increasing year by year, decade by decade, and when we see from independence of 1951 census till latest census of 2011, it is very interesting that our population, no doubt, is significantly increasing. But when we look at the decadal growth, the growth rate started showing it's a declining trend, especially from 1991. What it clearly indicates that though the population is a huge problem or huge issue of stabilizing it in an efforted way, but it is to certain extent we need to understand that there is a large variations in the concentration of population across various states and also within states, across regions or districts within the state. In that case, we have clear-cut idea that in the case of country like India, though country as a whole gives a different picture, but if we see in terms of various states and within states, various districts and blocks, there is an effort that we need to understand that there is a fair idea of stabilizing their population in major states, and in fact, more states are heading towards replacement level of their fertility, their life expectancy is increasing steadily, the health infrastructure has proved that they can be achieved significantly, and in that way, it is shown that there is a positiveness, there is an impact of development on the changes in the demographic front. For instance, if you look at the life expectancy, while in 1951, the life expectancy was only 37 years, it has improved to the extent of 54 years. In 1991, in 2000, it has shown 64 years, and in 2007, for instance, it has improved to 65 to 66 years. What about the changes in the crude birth rate and crude death rate? It is very clear. For instance, in the case of birth rate, which was very high to the extent of 40.8 years in 1951, has come down to 33.9 years in 1991, further came down to 26.1 years in 2000, and in 2007, it has come down to 23.1, and it is still coming down to a great extent. Similar is the situation in the case of crude death rate, which was very high to the extent of 25 years in 1991, has come down to 12.5 in 1991, further came down to 8.7 in 2000, and came down to heavily to the 7.4 in 2007, and further it is expected to be stabilized at a lesser level. Similar is the case in the case of IMR, infant mortality rate. Infant mortality rate, which was as high as 146 in earlier days, has come down to 110 in the case of 1991, further drastically came down to 70 in 2000 and to 55 in 2007, and the latest figures, it shows that it was around 44 per 1000 live births. This all clearly, it shows that we are able to succeed in changing various epidemiological shifts that have occurred in our society. We are able to reasonably increase the level of development, which has impacted in creating a huge health infrastructure when we talk about our public health systems like sub-centers, creation of primary health centers or urban development blocks or various dispensaries and hospitals. Even the doctor-nurse population ratios, when we talk in India, it has also shown a significant positive change. So, what it clearly reveals that the case of development has percolated in various issues in the area of health or in the area of education. So, there is a very high positiveness in these things. But we have to see that how inclusive in the percolation of the development among various social class groups. If we take for instance an indicator like infant mortality, which is a number of infants dying per 1000 live births, when we talk about, for example, data shows that when India was experiencing 70 per 1000 live births, for some of the caste groups, especially like scheduled castes, it was 83, scheduled tribes, it was as high as 84, and other disadvantaged was as high as 76, whereas other sections of population, the number is only 61.8. What it clearly indicates that when we talk about India as a whole, there are some sections of population who are not able to get the benefit from development, especially the health development and infrastructure of health. What that has shown clearly is that it is impacting their lives, and also the quality of life of the marginalized and vulnerable sections in our society are at their quality of life is at stake. So, that is why the planners and also policy makers, they have a huge challenge to see how inclusive our programs and schemes which can percolate and see that they can be achieved by all sections of population in our society. What it clearly reveals, in conclusion, we can say that no doubt the demographic transition in our country like India has started showing its impact, and there is a huge change that comes out in population characteristics, and we are one side we should be very happy to see that the population parameters which are measured especially through birth rates, death rates, we have a significant shift that we are able to achieve from our independence period to the current state. No doubt it is very positive that we are able to stabilize the population in reasonable time framework, but however, we have to keep in mind that the stabilization or achieving below replacement in fertility and also the great extent of minimizing or reducing the deaths is no doubt is an achievement, but we have to think that some of the states still struggle, while as most of the states have started showing in a positive way. But in that sense, we have to focus and concentrate on those states like Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh and others, some of these states where the population stabilization has to take place, where fertility and mortality are still at relatively higher level, and there is a need to bring down these population parameters in these societies. Another aspect which we need to understand in terms of the demographic situation over a period of time is that though to a great extent we are able to bring down the characteristics like infant mortality, the measurements like maternal mortality to a great extent, but still the challenge is how best we can minimize the deaths of children and deaths among mothers during reproductive period. This is the huge challenge, and that is why we need to focus the efforts, and our programs and schemes should be geared up so as to see that we, to a great extent, we can achieve. That's why one of the important challenges is, given the heterogeneity in our country, given the huge differences, and also given the diversity of population spread across different regions, different class groups, the challenge is how best the population parameters can be stabilized and brought down in those states or those regions where the population characteristics are at high level, and also reflecting on that the health infrastructure in these societies have to be improved to a great extent, and also we have to focus on the preventive aspects besides curative, so that the good quality of care and good access to healthcare facilities for the people can be provided in these areas, so that the population in those regions also experience good quality of care and also health access for them. In this way, the development and the demographic aspects are closely related, and they have to be taken into consideration together so that we can achieve an inclusive growth in our society.